Are you a podcaster? Maybe you've got that big idea and you're looking for a network to join. The multi-award-winning Ozcast Network can get your content to eyes and ears all over the world. Join now for the first month free, and you could be featuring this sound at the beginning of your podcast. Ozcast. Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.
Welcome to Hong Kong Confidential. I'm Jules Hannaford and I'm your host. I'm an Australian woman and I've been living in Hong Kong for many years. I'm a mother, a teacher, an author, and I want to share my wisdom and the wisdom of others with you. Thanks for joining me and I hope you enjoy the show. Today I'm here with Rebecca Hopkins. Hi Rebecca, thanks for joining me.
Hi Jules.
How are you?
Me. I'm good.
I believe you've been trained in the Brene Brown Daring Way. Can you tell me a bit more about that?
Yeah, so for those of your listeners who don't know about the work of Brene Brown, so the easiest way to access her work is through the TED.com website. So she did a TED Talk back in 2010 called The Power of Vulnerability. It's now had, I think, over 26 million views.
Wow, that's huge.
Yeah, it's massive. So something's really resonated with her and her work and what she talks about. Maybe it's helpful if I start with telling you a little bit about who she is.
Yeah.
So Dr. Brene Brown, she's a shame and vulnerability researcher based out of Houston in Texas in the US. And she's been studying concepts like vulnerability, shame, fear, and worthiness for about 12 years now. With that data that she's written a few books and she's got a certification program for psychologists, counsellors and coaches. She did her TED Talk that rose to fame back in 2010. I watched that in early 2011. And then, you know, when you watch a TED Talk, you find someone who resonates with you and you just start Googling them. So I Googled her, bought her books, consumed everything that I could find online of her and started using her work with my clients, with my one-on-one coaching clients, and had incredible results. So what I did then was subscribe to her newsletter, and I received an email in 2014 saying that she was certifying coaches, which I am one of, and I hopped straight onto it and was like, I can become certified in her work. Flew to London, did 3 days intense training in London, then a 10-week online program, and then a 6-month case consultation program to become certified to deliver her methodologies.
Oh, wow. So it's quite comprehensive.
Yeah, it is. So there's an assessment period at the beginning, then you do the online work, which really is going deep into the work that you'll then be able to teach. So her Daring Way methodology, it's a really experiential methodology based on her research. And you can use it in a personal or a professional setting. So I use it with my clients one-on-one, and I also run workshops. And I also use it in the corporate work I do in organisations. So, and we talk about topics like vulnerability, courage, shame, worthiness, and trust. And the primary focus of her work really is on developing a shame resilience skill set. So being able to move through shame productively.
And why do you think people feel shame, and why do you think it's such a big stumbling block for us?
So it probably helps if I define shame in her work. So shame in her work is defined as that deeply intense and painful feeling that you're not worthy of love and belonging. It's the fear of disconnection. And I think that it's one of those deep, dark emotions that a lot of people don't know about or understand, and secondly, don't know how to move through it when they're in shame, because it's a very physical. When I'm in a shame spiral, my stomach's going, my heart rate's going, my palms are sweating. It's very hard to find your way out of that productively.
Do you think there's a difference between shame and anxiety? Because what you're describing sounds like anxiety.
I think it shows up for people differently. So shame for me might feel very different to shame for you.
Sure.
And you're exactly right. Like my anxiety shows up very similarly. She also talks about the difference between shame and guilt, which I think is really helpful. So shame being I am a bad person, and guilt being I did something bad. So guilt being the focus on the behaviour and shame being the focus on who I am.
Right.
Which is a huge difference.
Yeah, it is a difference.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's amazing. Brene Brown says owning our story and loving ourselves through that process is the bravest thing we'll ever do. What does she mean by this, and how powerful can this transformation be in changing old patterns and beliefs?
This is one of her quotes that probably spoke to me the most out of all of hers. And how I kind of interpret this is that I think most of us are walking through the world carrying stories that if we think people found them out about us, that we might be less lovable. And so what we do is instead of sharing these stories, we keep them to ourselves, and they become really heavy and hard to carry, and it shuts us down from being seen. So what she's talking about there is if we can look at these stories, which, you know, for some people they're big stories around trauma, shame, and fear of disconnection, but sometimes they can be smaller and less heavy, but they still stop us from being seen. So I think everyone has some kind of story that they find it hard to share.
Can you just explain to me what you mean by being seen?
Yeah, so this is about her work around worthiness and authenticity. So we're all wired for connection. We want to be seen. We want to know that we matter. We want to be heard. And I see this a lot in my coaching. So I sit one-on-one with people and really just spend, my sessions are like an hour, and I spend it just listening. And what I see is really quite transformative when someone has their story being held by someone else. And that's when you're seen for who you are, flaws and all, with no judgment.
So it's really about listening and understanding people and taking the time, creating the space.
Yes, and not trying to fix them and not trying to cheer them up. And I think, you know, we do a lot of work in Brene's world around empathy, the ability to sit across from someone else when they're in pain and just holding that and not trying to fix them, not trying to cheer them up, but just being there. And I think listening and empathy are two of the greatest gifts you can give another human being.
What's the difference between empathy and sympathy?
So in Brene's work, empathy is feeling with you. So if you come to me and have a really painful experience and you're sharing it with me, sympathy might sound like, oh, you poor thing, oh, Jules. And so I'm feeling for you, as opposed to empathy might sound like, man, that sounds really hard, Jules. Do you want to talk about it? There's no hierarchy. There's just a space to be. And one of the best things I learned out of her work with empathy, that rarely can you say anything that will fix the situation. So it's best to just be there and say something like, I really don't know what to say right now, but I'm here for you. Listen.
Listening and perhaps reflecting back how that person's feeling.
Yeah. In Brene's work, there's 4 components to empathy. The first one being staying out of judgment. I think what we do when we hear stories from other people, we can go straight into our own world and cast judgment on them. So staying out of judgment, number 1, to be empathetic, staying out of judgment. Secondly, taking the other person's perspective. So literally putting down your own viewpoint, stepping into the shoes of the person sitting opposite you and wondering what it's like for them.
And that's not so easy, is it, to do that? No, because we really do look at things from our own experiences and our own perspectives.
And that requires some self-management. You've got to really recognise in yourself that you are using your own perspective and not theirs.
And do you think it's really common that we judge just automatically?
Yeah, absolutely.
So to suspend judgment is a real skill, isn't it?
So if you can even do that one thing, like staying out of judgment and being curious as to what it might be like for that other person, is really powerful. So you've got staying out of judgment, taking the other person's perspective. The third one is connecting with the emotion that you're hearing. So often with empathy, I think, if I haven't experienced what you're sharing with me, then I can't relate. So I remember a couple of years ago, one of our best friends, a couple friends, the wife had an affair and was really disconnected from our whole social group. And I caught up with her, much to the disappointment of all of our friends who'd taken like the guy's side who hadn't had the affair. And I sat down with her and she was struggling. And I said, tell me what's going on. And you could see that she was really in a shame spiral. She's like, what have I done? Like, I've done this, terrible thing. And I literally said to her, I get it. And she said, you've had an affair? And I was like, no, but I've done shit that I feel bad about. And I've done stuff that I regret. Yeah. So what I did there was I connected with the feeling of regret that she was having, not the act of having the affair. Because who hasn't done stuff they are not proud of?
Everyone. Yeah.
So empathy is accessible for everyone if you go below the the behavior and get to the actual feelings that are underneath. So I could say to her, it sounds like you're feeling some deep sadness. If I do that third piece, which is connecting with the emotion I'm hearing, then it leads to the fourth, which is getting a clear understanding. So she might come back to me and say, I'm not sad. I'm like pissed off that my marriage wasn't in a better shape. So first one, staying out of judgment, then taking the other person's perspective, connecting with the emotion I'm hearing, and then checking in with the other person to see
that you've got the right emotion.
Yeah, so then that gives them a chance to come back and go, no.
If it wasn't this regret emotion and it was the emotion of being pissed off, then you need to then reconnect with some time in your life of when you were pissed off.
Exactly.
And then find out what that feeling was at that time. And the actual behaviours or the incidences don't need to be connected. They don't need to be alike. We can have the same feelings with a multitude of different events, can't we?
So it comes up a lot.
That's so cool.
It is, and it comes up a lot with grief. So whenever you're with someone who's either lost someone they care about or is struggling with grief, we often tend to run away from it because we might not have lost a parent or we might not have been through a grief process. But we all have experienced some sort of loss. It doesn't have to be a loss of a grandparent or a partner or whatever the person you're sitting with's going through. You can still connect to that emotion underneath.
In that situation, you might have grief for a time when you lost a pet as a child or when you didn't get a job. But then you might think, oh, but that grief isn't as big as what they're going through, so how can I relate? But it's still the same feeling, and everybody's levels of grief in any situation vary. So it's really just connecting with that emotion. It doesn't have to be on the same scale.
Yeah, and you're pointing to something incredibly important in Brene's work with what you just said. So she refers to it as comparative suffering. What we tend to do is we rank order suffering. That my journey around infertility, if I've had a miscarriage at 6 weeks and, one of my friends had a full-term loss, then is her loss more worthy than mine? And what we do is we compare them. So I might not share my story of loss because I think, oh, it's not as severe as hers. And she might not share her loss because she thinks, that guy over there lost his adult son. Like, who am I to complain about my loss of a baby? And so what we do is we rank order suffering and it doesn't help anyone.
No.
And
because then the communication breaks down because you're too afraid to empathise.
And compassion, which is needed in that situation, is infinite. I can be compassionate to someone who's lost a baby at 6 weeks and be compassionate to someone who's had a full-time loss, plus compassionate to someone who's had an adult child die. Like, it's not like a slice of pizza where I go, if I give one slice to you, there's only 7 left for the rest. It's infinite. And if we start to see the world from a compassionate viewpoint, which empathy is a part of that, then the world becomes a better place because we're thinking more compassionately, we're sharing that.
And these skills that you're talking about, they can be in families, they can be in friendships. It doesn't have to be a coach or a psychologist or a counsellor that uses these skills. These are really valuable for everyday life.
Yeah, and they're teachable. So I think one of the myths of empathy is that we're either born empathic or not. I do a lot of corporate workshops and I teach empathy in corporate settings. And I've had people in there go, oh, my wife says I'm just not empathetic, or my wife says I'm no good at this. And so people don't try. But empathy is a skill you can learn, you can teach it, and you can actually practice. These are a lot of Brene's work is daily practices.
What's your opinion on the stories that we have that shape us and how we should challenge to change our perspectives on those stories? How can we make these changes ourselves instead of repeating these same patterns and behaviours and wallowing in our own misery, perhaps?
Look, I think a lot of us are walking around with stories and we tend to categorize them into good or bad. The good ones we're happy to share, the bad ones we just kind of push to the side, and we don't even acknowledge them to ourselves because they're possibly too painful, or we don't share them because we think we're going to get judged.
Can you give me an example of someone who's leaned into their own story and used that as a catalyst for change?
One of the most powerful stories I've had access to recently is a TED Talk by 2 people, and it's called Our Story of Rape and Reconciliation. Thordis Elva is a woman from Iceland and Tom Stranger is an Australian guy. In 1996, he did an exchange program and went to Iceland and was dating Thordis. She was his girlfriend and they'd had a romance. After a school dance, he actually raped her and then they went their separate ways. He went back to Australia. And this is about him and her owning their story. The story wasn't revisited. She contacted him years later to talk about it, and they agreed to visit, to meet. I think they met in South Africa to meet and talk about it, because this was obviously a huge story for her that what I really loved about hearing her talk is she wanted to own it, which means acknowledging it, having a look at it, digging into it and seeing, what can I learn from this story? It was a really powerful meeting that they ended up actually writing a book about it. So the reason I bring that particular story up is we often hear from survivors of rape or sexual assault. We rarely hear from the perpetrator. And this is an Aussie young guy who's standing on a TED stage telling everyone he's a rapist.
Wow,
and
powerful.
It is the owning of his story. And they talk a lot about the labels being really unhelpful, being the victim, being the rapist, that labeling, and this is back to Brene's work as well, is really a dehumanizing act. Whether we're labeling people in the corporate worlds as a lot of, they're a bully, they're a problem child, they're this, they're that. It stops them from being seen for the person they are. And so what they did was they stood on stage and talked about the dehumanization of these labels and really owning their stories. And he had something in there which said, something you have done doesn't have to constitute the sum of who you are. So he's taken this act that he did and dug into it, acknowledged it, spoken about it, and now spoken publicly about it in order to really own his story. Life-changing.
Yeah, that's so courageous and powerful, isn't it?
I think the title puts people off. I've sent it to a few people and they don't want to see it.
What's the title?
Our Story of Rape and Reconciliation.
Oh, right. Yeah,
it messes with our heads that you can reconcile after rape.
Yeah.
It really does. But I think it's got about 4 million views. It's worth a watch just to see the power of owning your own story.
Yeah, I'll definitely check it out. It sounds amazing. Is there anything else you can share with us?
The other one that's come up a lot recently for me that I've seen some interviews around is a guy called Lewis Howes. So he is an American author, entrepreneur, and former football player in the US. And he's actually got a podcast called The School of Greatness. He shares his and owns his story of being raped when he was 5. And the powerful thing about his story is he talks about what it's like when you don't own your story. He didn't talk about that until recently. And he said how it showed up for him was anger, rage, perfectionism, being great at things. His relationships were falling apart because he just carried this heavy story and this anger through into his 20s and 30s. So he's come out recently and started talking about it. You know, he worked with psychologists and did a lot of work. You don't own these stories without doing a lot of work. And it doesn't have to be with, you know, a professional, but you have to talk to someone about it, someone you trust. So he talks about it, and you know, to speak of these stories publicly is really difficult.
Because then you're coming back to this issue of shame.
Yeah. And actually the shame resilience model of Brene's has 4 parts to it. The first one is knowing your own triggers, knowing the things that set you off, that send you into shame. Once you've got that piece, that's an awareness piece. The second is doing some critical thinking. So if these are setting me off, what is it about these? And really digging into them. And she's got an approach to do that. The third piece is connecting with someone else. So it doesn't mean standing on a TED, stage and talking about it or blogging about it, but sharing with someone. And we talk about sharing with someone who's earned the right to hear your story.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, which I think is really powerful because, I'm a recovering oversharer. Like you sit down at a party with me, I'll tell you about my grief, and often the other side of that is it's not met with empathy. And so what I learned was to pull that back and share with people who've earned the right to hear it.
Oh, that's lovely. And there might be a little lesson in that for me. I think I'm a not recovered oversharer.
Hi, I'm Jules. I'm an oversharer. Yeah, you're in good company.
Yeah, so that's actually a little realisation that I've had already. Okay.
And then the fourth part of the shame resilience model is, so once you've spoken to someone about your shame, is speaking about shame. So both of those stories, Lewis and Thordis and Tom, they use the word shame in their stories, and they're starting to voice what it's like to feel that shame. And shame is really interesting. So shame can't survive being spoken. So if you put shame in a petri dish and doused it with silence, secrecy, and judgment, it grows. You put it in a petri dish and douse it with empathy, and it can't survive. Like, empathy is the antidote to shame.
That's really amazing. That makes complete sense. So there's some really, really useful, practical tips for anyone dealing with shame, those 4 actions that they can take.
And that's out of her book. So you can access this, whether it's through a Daring Way certified facilitator like me, and there's a few of us in Hong Kong. I think there's 3 of us in Hong Kong, and through her books as well. So she has her shame resilience model in one of her books. I thought it was just me, is the title of the book. But yeah, it's powerful work.
So powerful. So you do a lot of body safety workshops and body awareness workshops. Can you tell me about that?
Yeah, so body safety education is learning tools and strategies to help reduce the likelihood of your child being a victim of sexual abuse. I work primarily with parents, and it's about giving them tools and strategies to help strengthen their child's voice when it comes to who touches their body and who doesn't.
Are you getting parents coming in a preventative manner, or in a okay, something's gone wrong, we now need to deal with it, or both?
So I'm getting parents who come definitely because they're worried about it. And also I tend to have parents who've had something either happen to them or their families. So people who know that it's real. With prevention of sexual abuse, you can fall into the trap of thinking that's never going to happen to me. And there was this really powerful story when I first started doing the research for this workshop. So my workshops are for parents. I do 2, parents for 2 to 4-year-olds and parents of 5 to 10-year-olds. And the reason I do those age groups is that statistically, the highest risk category of sexual abuse is between 3 and 8 years old. So that's the age group that I focus on.
Because they're the most vulnerable and unable to say no or get themselves out of it.
Yeah. And I think we think that, I grew up in the 80s in Australia and it was all about stranger danger. Don't go home with that guy who says, come with me after school.
Yeah.
Statistically, it's not a stranger. 90% of cases are by someone your child knows. Teachers, coaches, parents, grandparents, older siblings, cousins. And statistically, the places that they would be sexually abused are homes, schools, churches, all sorts of. Statistically, and this is an Australian statistic, 1 in 3 adults wouldn't believe a child if they came to them and said that they'd been sexually abused or sexually assaulted. And I think that's incredibly interesting because with the research I've done, what that is we walk through life filing people into good people and bad people. If we're walking through the city on a night, we know we're going to stay away from that group of people. They're good, they're bad. The problem with when this happens by someone we know is we've already got an image in our head that that person's a good person. So you're telling me they did something bad. I can't reconcile that. We tend to just take the easy route, which is, well, that's not true. That didn't happen. So 1 in 3 Australians wouldn't believe a child. And that's one of the things I talk about in the workshop. I give a 6-point checklist of what to do if a child comes to you and says they've been sexually abused. Point number 1, believe them. Absolutely. And it's difficult for us to do that because loving grandparents can do hideous things. Loving partners can make bad choices. And so we have to reconcile that ourselves. Yeah, it actually comes up a lot, whether it's been in my friendship groups and I know people who've been sexually abused. The mother is generally where the anger is targeted towards because they didn't keep their child safe. And one of the first things I talk about in my workshops is introducing, especially when you've got young kids, the term safe and unsafe, because we tend not to. Some body safety education will say yes feelings and no feelings, whereas the work I use says recognizing when you feel unsafe, because that feeling of being unsafe, whether you're lost in the shopping mall and you can't see your mum, is the same feeling when you're being touched inappropriately. So you've got to really have a way to help your child recognize that feeling of being unsafe and be able to articulate it. And I talk a lot about that, especially with parents of younger kids. This is about building trust. So using the correct anatomical names for your private parts.
You think that's important?
Globally.
Don't use vajayjay.
No vajayjay, no
willy,
cookie, fanny, whatever. Penis, vagina, vulva. And there's a couple of really important reasons. One is that your child is statistically more likely to come to you and tell you they've been touched inappropriately if they know the correct words, because they have a confidence around it. Also, and this blew my mind when I read this, they interviewed in the US sexual abuse offenders, and found that they were less likely to go near children who used the correct anatomical names for their private parts because they knew they'd been educated in body safety.
Oh, that's so
that alone
interesting.
Is like a good enough reason to use the words penis and vagina. And it's not easy. I've said it so much that it doesn't even bother me to say the word vagina. I can say it on the bus, like it does not. But if you've never said it before, it's going to feel a little awkward coming out of your mouth. So what I do is talk about the reasons behind why you should use them, and I get people to say it. The first time you say anything, any word that's like you haven't said before, it's going to feel weird. My kids are all educated in body safety, and I went to they go to a kindergarten. So I sat down with their teachers and said, because they're only just out of nappies, so they still need help going to the toilet. And I said, just so you know, my children will be using the words penis and vagina, and that'd be great if who's helping them can use the correct anatomical names too.
Oh, see, good on you for requesting that and making them aware.
But I have pushback. What will the other parents think? I had to take a breath, and so I've had to start to educate my children's teachers with body safety as well. And I think that's a really powerful thing, because now my kids' teachers know that my children are educated in body safety. They'll start talking about it. Yeah. So it starts to have this ripple effect in the community. The more we talk about these tools and strategies, the more people know, the more protected our children are.
Yeah, it's so important. And I think that's something that parents and even teachers can really think about and take on board. But I think that's great advice. Is there any other top tips for body safety that you want to share, apart from using the anatomical terms?
I want to pause on the anatomical terms and just say one more thing that I think is helpful to get people using the names, is that often as adults we equate the labels penis and vagina with sex because that's our experience, whereas our kids don't. So they are not going to so husbands tend to struggle a lot with using the word vagina because for them it's about sex. Yeah. Whereas if we think of it as it's like our elbow or our wrist or our knee, it's a vagina, it's just a body part. Our children don't have the same adult mindset. So if we can decouple the sex piece from the words vagina and penis, that's really helpful.
And that's going to make it easier for the parents,
Absolutely.
Isn't it, to move into that space of talking about them correctly.
And the first time's the hardest. So the first time you say vagina, it's the hardest. So I had an experience where I was doing this body safety work, and Rosie, she was 4 then, she's nearly 5. She was in the bath and she's playing around with her vagina and she's like, "Mummy, I found my button." And my husband was there and I was like, "Honey, that's your clitoris." And like my husband looked at me, I'm like, "I don't know, I've never said clitoris before." And I'm like, "Is that okay?" And he's like, "You did great." He's giving me like a double thumbs up for using the word clitoris. I can now say to you the word clitoris because it's a body part.
It is a body part.
How many people have said the word clitoris out loud? Yeah. Like they're not words, but the power is speaking them. So get home and just, if you've got young kids, use the words vagina and penis. And if you live in Hong Kong and you have a helper, talk to your helper about using those words. Talk to your husband and you'll start to normalise them. Yeah. And your kid will statistically be more likely to talk to you.
And that also will lead to less shame around the body parts later on when they're adults or older.
Yeah, absolutely.
Brilliant. Do you think this is something that should be taught in schools?
It is in Australia. It's on the curriculum.
Is it?
Yeah. That is why I started these workshops. So
I didn't even know that. That's amazing. So Hong Kong educators, listen up.
Yeah, absolutely. So the work I use is the work of Janine Sanders. So she's written a series of books. If you've got 2 to 4-year-olds, the book I recommend is called No Means No, and that's about permission-based touch. In Hong Kong, we have a lot of grandparents visit. If you're an expat, you have grandparents visit. And invariably when the grandparents leave, they lean over to your toddler and go, "Give me a kiss, give me a cuddle." And for those of us who don't practice, body safety, we shove our child towards and say, "Give grandma a kiss," because we don't want grandma to feel bad. Whereas No Means No has literally a way in there to say no to that if they feel unsafe. So it says, if Auntie Jeannie asks me for a kiss and I don't want to, no means no. I can shake her hand, give her a high five or blow her a kiss, but if I don't want to touch or kiss her, no means no. Yes, so you read this to like 2 to 4-year-olds and they are very clear who they don't want to touch, but it doesn't mean they can be disrespectful. They've got a choice.
Yeah, and how often do people throw themselves at people for cuddles and kisses? And I can remember as a kid being over-tickled by my grandfather and it really, really annoyed me and my dad even. Yes. And also over-hugged by my grandpa. I used to get these big bear hugs. I absolutely hated it and it hurt. It was uncomfortable. It hurt. It felt icky. I mean, it wasn't
safe, right?
It wasn't, I don't think there was anything untoward about it, but I hated it and I had no skills to get out of that situation.
And the fact that you remember it as well means
totally remember it.
So this is another part of the body safety workshop, which is around creating a culture in your family of permission-based touch. And that tickling story, so I literally was doing this workshop and I went home and Adam was tickling Rosie And her first reaction as a 3-year-old, and she's enjoying it, no, stop. And I said to Adam, when she says that, stop. So the next time he did it, he was tickling her and she went, no, stop. Adam stopped. And she looked at him and then she said, keep going. Okay. I was like, okay, now we're getting somewhere. Great. Now we're saying the words that we actually mean.
Oh, that's
and so having this, if our kids, if their no's are expected to be honoured in our house, when they go out in the world, they're going to expect people who touch them, when they say no, that it's going to be listened to.
Yeah.
Like my little Maggie now, my twins have just turned 3, so Rosie's almost 5. If I forget to ask permission to kiss her and I just kiss her head, she's like, Mum, you didn't ask. Like, so she's very clear.
Wow.
She's onto it. And so it feels a little awkward to say, honey, can I give you a kiss? But I feel what I'm teaching them is a lifelong expectation that people should ask before they touch you.
It's so healthy, isn't it?
And I wasn't raised like that either.
No. And it's so interesting because we underestimate how much little kids understand. We underestimate how much they get what's going on. That's something that I really understood when my daughter was very young. I used to give her little challenges thinking there's no way she'll understand or be able to do what I asked. Beings. She could do it. And I was like, holy moly, I can't believe that. So don't underestimate if you're talking to your 18-month-old about body safety that they won't get it, because they will. And they'll get what they need from it as well.
In the pack that I got from Australia in order to set up this workshop, they have these cards. These are picture cards with a picture of a child in a situation. And what you do, you use them in schools or with your families to say, does this child feel safe or unsafe? And the kids will point and say. There's one picture, which is a kid in a car seat in the back of the car holding her teddy. And I held it up to my daughter and I said, do you think she feels safe or unsafe? And she said, unsafe. And I was literally about to say, no, she's got her car seat on. She's safe. And I said to my daughter, tell me why you think she feels unsafe. And she said, because she doesn't have her mummy or daddy with her. And I was like, man, kids are wise. Like, you've got to park your own assumption that you know better. You've hit the nail on the head. Kids are wiser than we believe.
They really are.
Yeah.
Can you tell me about your anatomy of grief workshops and what they involved?
Yeah, so this is a new offering for me. Grief is one of those topics that we rarely talk about, and we don't know how to talk about it, and we don't know what to say when people are experiencing it. And until I went through a grief process myself, I didn't know how to talk about it. And what happened for me is when I went through my grief process, I actually used my grief process to move through. So Brene's got a methodology called Rising Strong, which is when you're in the arena and you're face down and you're getting your ass kicked, how do you become resilient to that shame that you're feeling? And I used my grief process to test that methodology and unearthed some stuff that I hadn't even considered. And so as I've learned over the years about grief, I wanted to share that because it's really powerful. There's a component in her Rising Strong book and the methodology that is around grief. And she talks about it having 3 components. First of all, there's a loss. It could be a person, like you said earlier, it could be a dream, it could be a relationship, but there's some loss. Then, and this isn't in order, but the second piece is around longing. There's a longing for something to be different, whether it's in the relationship or you want the person back, you miss them so much. There's a longing. And then there's a feeling of feeling lost. How do I navigate my life now? How do I integrate this grief? And I've talked about grief with my corporate clients, and it has been incredibly powerful because grief is something here in Hong Kong that isn't spoken about at all.
Why do you think that is?
I think there's cultural implications. I don't think it's talked about in many countries, but I think here talking about death has cultural implications that I'm not even aware of.
Yeah, I know there's a whole lot of bad luck associated with death, isn't there? And there's also my understanding of the Chinese culture is that a lot of difficult topics are just sort of ignored.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's easy or it's just the way they're brought up, or I'm not sure why.
Yeah, and I think if I can, talk about it in a way that's healthy and productive and gives people the language to talk about grief, they can then explore their own grief more fully, but also be there for other people in their grief. So that workshop is about talking through the anatomy of it. Like it's a complicated emotion. So what are the components? And there's a 4th piece that isn't in Brene's work, but I'm reading his book at the moment. So there's a guy called Frank Ostaseski who has written a book called The 5 Invitations. It's called Discovering What Death Can Teach Us About Living Fully. I listened to his podcast. Waking Up with Sam Harris is an incredible podcast, and Frank was on there talking about, he's done some work in the hospice. He's in the hospice space on having a productive death. I've probably done his work a disservice, but he literally helps people die and how to live fully from that. And he added a piece in the podcast which was a loosening. So you've got a loss, you've got a longing, and you're feeling lost. And what I learned from my own grief experience was over the years, there was a loosening to it. And it meant I could look back and, you know, bringing it back to owning our stories, it meant I could look back at that grief process and see what could I learn so that I can do things differently. So I think that was really beautiful to add on that 4th piece as you move through the grief process. At some point, there is a loosening. And if there isn't, then that's where I think help is needed, because we can often become stuck in our grief and we can't move.
Oh, right.
And when that happens, grief can be so complicated.
Can you share your story of grief with us? That'd be amazing.
Yeah. So my husband and I started trying to have kids. We got married in 2006, and literally I wanted to have kids. He wanted to get married, and I was like, okay, let's get married then, and then we can start having kids. So I was 31 at the time. We tried for a year with no luck, and then I went to the doctor and we decided we were going to do IVF. Now, if you've ever seen an IVF ad, it has a picture of a baby on it. And so my husband and I are like, IVF equals baby, you just pay some money and off you go. Did all the tests, couldn't find anything wrong with my husband's sperm or with my uterus. So we started the first round of IVF. When you go into the IVF process, you're hoping for, so what they do is they give you what's called a follicular stimulating hormone, which is your body will produce 1 mature egg every month. And there's only 3 days during the month that you can actually get pregnant. And it's that 1 mature egg that either fertilizes or doesn't. What IVF does is gives you a hormone that matures more of those eggs in the hope that they'll extract a higher number. Therefore, there's a higher chance of them fertilizing and you getting pregnant. Usually you're aiming for about 15 mature eggs. So my husband and I had gone into that process. We're like, okay, 15, we can do this. If there's 30, great, but 15, we'll go 15 eggs.
It's like a sporting
Yeah,
event.
it is, because I'm like, we just got to get this done. You know, I was 32, I think, by the time we did this.
Yeah.
And I remember going into that first scan, and they scan your ovaries so they can see how many eggs are on each side, how many follicles, are on each side. And I had 2. And I remember sitting in that doctor's office and just having that shame. I didn't have the words for shame at the time, but having this wash over me of disappointment with my body and what, like 2? Like, so if statistically, if there's 2, only 1 will fertilize and then I don't get pregnant, my mind kind of went on all different tangents. We left there. I remember we were in Melbourne. I got into the car with my husband and he put his hand on my knee and I said, don't touch me. I don't want to speak about this. I don't want to talk about this. I don't want to talk. And I went back to work. He went back to work. And I was just in this like shame shitstorm spiral. We then continued with more IVF. I kind of worked through that. I was like, okay, let's give it another go. They upped the hormones. 1.
Oh.
I did 6 rounds of IVF trying with my own eggs. And then we went to the doctor, and knowing when to stop is really hard with IVF because you can keep going if you've got enough money, but we just weren't getting the results. And this had been, I think we were 3 years in by this point.
Oh.
So trying to do that while you've got a corporate job and
stressful,
holding myself together while I was falling apart was the first part of my grief. And it was interesting. We went to the doctor and he said, it's time to stop. There's no point. And I was like, what about the ad? There was a baby. Like, how does that, like, hang on. And by this point, we'd spent tens of thousands of dollars.
Yeah.
Like, it's no small. We were lucky enough. We'd both had corporate jobs long enough to
afford it.
But
to come out with nothing after spending all that money.
Except I now had all these, like, food allergies and all these stuff happening to my body from the hormones. He said, your only option is to use donor eggs. And I was like, well, that'll never happen. Like, I'm not, like, that's not how I want to create my family.
Why did you have that initial reaction?
Oh, shame, not genetically mine, like wanting to see my blue eyes in my kid. I don't know. There's something quite animalistic about it. I'm not sure, but it was just, that was not something I wanted to consider. this is a process. And I went to a counsellor. We talked about it a lot. She sent us home and we did some sticky note work together on adopting kids versus egg donor, having kids versus no kids. And we started to have some really beautiful conversations. And I think one of the best things we did was stay connected to each other. A lot of marriages fall apart during infertility.
They do. And
so Adam and I become much stronger through it. And we were doing the adoption versus donor eggs. And what I realized is that I really wanted to be pregnant. I really wanted to have that experience. And what we discovered about Adam is he felt guilty about the child being half genetically his and not mine. And we went back to counselling, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, we decided to think about donor eggs. We went to a wedding up in Brisbane where Adam's from. And it wasn't a wedding, actually. It was my father-in-law's 50th. And we went to his party and we met lots of people. We flew back to Melbourne and Adam's mum rings and says, do you remember that couple you met? They want to be your egg donor. And Adam and I are like, how do they even know about that? I'm like, sometimes it's, worth it when people talk about his stories.
That oversharing.
Yeah. And so we then went through this process of flying up to Brisbane, having counselling, meeting this girl who wanted to be an egg donor. And she had these 5 beautiful kids. She could look at her husband and fall pregnant. So we met with her, which was such an awkward having that conversation. So there was the husband, the wife, me and Adam, and we talked about sport for the first 20 minutes until I had the bravery to say, are we going to talk about the egg donor situation? And you have to do these first meetings to see how, because they're going to be half siblings of her kids, and how does that look? Anyway, we worked through it all. It's a really long story, by the way.
I'm riveted.
We worked through it all. At that point, I'd got a job advising the CEO of Suncorp. So my job moved to Brisbane anyway, this crazy job. And so we were in Brisbane and started to do the process with her being our egg donor. And what they do then is they line the donor cycle up with mine. She goes through the IVF process. They extract the eggs from her ovaries, fertilise them with Adam's sperm, and then put them back inside me. My body's got to be ready to accept the embryos and her body's got to be ready to produce the eggs. So it's quite a long process. Anyway, we're up in Brisbane. She's ready to go and they're waiting for my cycle to catch up. And it took it was 7 weeks and I still hadn't got my period. And I was like, this is just taking forever. And Adam said to me, do you think you might be pregnant? And I was like, no, babe, come on, I'm not pregnant. And we were having a drink. It was a Friday night and I was feeling sick and I was tired. And I was like, okay, I'll do a pregnancy test. So the next morning I do a pregnancy test and I walk into Adam in the bathroom I'm pregnant.
You got naturally pregnant?
Naturally pregnant.
Oh, my gosh.
So then I'm walking around with my legs so tightly together, just oh, my God. And I couldn't even...
On bed rest.
Yeah, and I couldn't even comprehend. I was working for the CEO and, I had this job that did not allow me to be sick. And so we didn't tell anyone and we got to the 12-week scan and we were still not telling anyone. And so then we were like, okay, we can tell everyone now. We told everyone obviously incredibly happy for us. We'd been through so much. So we were still in Brisbane and I went to the doctor with Adam and we were always very big on seeing the heartbeat of the child. We're like, if you see the heartbeat, you are you're okay.
Yeah, you're there.
Yeah. So we go into my 20-week scan, which is the one where they do all the abnormality tests. And by this point I'm showing, everyone knows I'm pregnant. And I go in and they do the scan and we see the heartbeat and Adam and I a little high five, yeah, it's all good. And now in hindsight, I realised that the person doing the scan had taken a really long time. He walked out of the room, he came back, he sat down and he put his hand on mine and he said, I need to tell you that your baby's not well. Oh. And so I go into this whole what do you mean they're not well? Is she going to live? And he said, we need to talk about that. And so Adam and I can't even really remember what happened, but they kind of take you into the little grief room and they give you a box of tissues. And he said, your child has spina bifida, which I don't know if you know what spina bifida is, but it's from when the spine doesn't form correctly. And what that means is wherever in your spine the protrusion occurs, anything below that doesn't work. So our baby had it quite high up. And so he started saying to me, all the things that would be wrong with the child if it was born. Wouldn't be able to use its bowels, wouldn't be able to walk. The baby also had the brain stem deformed as well, so would need a shunt through the brain. At one point I asked him to stop. I was like, you can stop now. And he's like, you have to hear this. And there's this like incredibly long list of how hard it would be to live with spina bifida. And we left there. And I said to the doctor, can you just write on a piece of paper whether it's a girl or a boy? And then if I want to open that envelope, I can open it. And if I don't want to, I won't. And we then go into a meeting with another doctor, and he says to me, so we're going to book you in on Tuesday to give birth? And I'm like,
yeah, because once you're past a certain time, it's not an abortion, it's giving birth. You've got to go through the labour. So it must be so traumatic.
So that blew my mind. Can you not just knock me out and take this baby out of me? I'd really disconnected from the child that I was growing, and they send you to counselling, genetic testing, and it all happens fairly quickly. So the scan was Tuesday. I gave birth to my baby the next Tuesday. We had a funeral the Tuesday after. Like, it was just this, like, 2-week process.
That must be like a whirlwind of shock.
Oh, and Adam and I really just shrunk our worlds. It was interesting. I went to a counsellor, a perinatal, I think they're called, counsellor, who help you with the grief process. So I hadn't given birth yet. And she said to me, are you going to hold your child? And I was like, I haven't really thought of that. I'm like, I don't know. I don't really know what a child at 21 weeks looks like. And she said, it looks like a baby. And so I was just like, I don't think I can do that. I don't know. And it was interesting. I spoke to Adam's sister at the time, and she said to me, she's got 2 boys, and she said, no matter what happens to my boys and their bodies, I'd still want to see them. And that really hit home with me. I thought that was really important. And then the counsellor had said, give your baby the entry into this world that she deserves. And so we did. And so we called her Ruby. So she was born, this was 2010, so that's 7 years ago.
And you did hold her?
Yeah.
And what was that like?
Oh, the most beautiful and sad experience. We talk a lot in Brene's work about these deep emotions coexisting. Like, I absolutely know for a fact I can be incredibly sad and incredibly grateful at the same time that I held her body. And you know what? I turned her body over to see her spine. I don't know what I would have thought if she wasn't unwell, but it was there. It was like part of her spine was like sticking out of her back.
Right.
But she was a little baby, and we took photos that, we've never shared with anyone except, Adam and I have seen them, because a baby at 21 weeks is just a baby with no fat on them. So it's a very thin little baby. But yeah, so the labour process is horrific. You're in a ward, we have a private room, but there's people giving birth to live babies and happiness, and it's a beautiful moment. And giving birth to a child that won't live is incredibly devastating, especially when I thought I was never going to fall pregnant. So
yeah, that must have been incredibly, incredibly devastating.
And the grief process that, we shut down our worlds, like flowers turned up like you wouldn't believe. And at one point I said to the guy, just stop bringing them. Just stop. This house is just, I can't take it anymore. And
is that because it was a reminder, or it was just too trivial, or it wasn't important? Or
I was feeling shame around it as well. Like, everyone knew I was pregnant, so everyone wanted to talk to me about it, and I just did not want to talk to anyone. I couldn't process it. And there was one girl, and I can't even remember her name. There was one girl I worked with, and she said to me, you have to go through the heart of what is painful to find a deep and unshakable peace. And I'd never heard that quote before. I don't even know who that quote is. And so we did. We were like, okay, we are just going to feel this. And, we were lucky enough to have the money we both quit our corporate jobs. Adam was expected to go back to work in 2 weeks. I was lucky enough, the CEO said, take as much time as you need. And I took about 6 weeks. I went back to work, but I wasn't me. I was a different person now.
That's interesting that you both quit your jobs. Like, what a massive life-changing event.
My husband's suggestion. He said, we can't keep doing this. And so we quit our corporate jobs. I remember having this big, like, all these spreadsheets up on the walls, and we were like, how much money have we got? Where do you want to start? So we went to Sri Lanka first. One of my best friends got married, and she's Sri Lankan, got married there. We went to her wedding, and then we did 2 months in Bali in Ubud doing yoga every day. So there's an Ashtanga yoga centre there where we just felt our grief. So we had 2 months of sobbing and connecting and talking.
By you guys leaving your jobs, taking the time, going travelling, doing this yoga, which is really about mindfulness and well-being, that probably really helped you massively to cope with the grief and move through it?
It was really interesting, actually. Like, we weren't very conscious of what we were doing. We just kind of knew that we couldn't keep turning up to work. Like, it felt really disingenuous. So we went to Bali, and doing the yoga every day gave us the space to think and talk. And I remember lying on the mat and just sobbing. And the yoga teacher had no idea of our story, but she would just put her hand on my head and said, it'll shift. And I'll be like, when? And so we did that. And then we went to Italy. One of Adam's friends was playing in Padova, which is in the north of Italy, playing rugby over there. So we're like, hey, do you want some visitors? So we went over there. And by this point, it had been 3 or 4 months and we were talking again about donor eggs. And so I started Googling egg donation. Where in the world can you do this? For some reason, I didn't go back to the Brisbane couple who'd offered. I'd kind of been through, I felt a lot of shame around letting her down because that was the whole start of the journey. So, and we were away, and Adam and I actually met in London originally. And when we were in Italy, we started to run out of money, and I was like, I wonder if my old work have any jobs. And so I emailed Phil, the guy I'd worked with 10 years ago. And I was like, hi, it's Beck. I'm not sure if you remember me. I used to work for you. And he's like, do you want a job? Or come back. And I'm like, okay. So we ended up moving to London and living there again, which, my heart's in London. I love it as a city. So it was nice to be with people who didn't have kids. And it was a very big shift from the life we'd had in Australia.
Interesting that you left all that behind.
All of it.
Isn't that amazing?
All of it.
That's quite a severe approach to dealing with grief, isn't it?
And in hindsight, we were really lucky to be able to do that. Some people go through what I went through when they've already got kids who are in school
and they can't exit, and they've got all these reminders, whereas you sort of left a lot of reminders behind.
All of it.
And was that helpful for moving you through the grief process faster?
I don't know. It's the first time I'd been through a grief process.
Yeah, and we don't know what's fast and what's slow anyway, do we? It's an unquantifiable kind of concept.
And I'm still learning about my grief. It was interesting. I did my coaching training when I was in London, and I'd had a coach as part of my corporate job, and I really wanted to do that when I was in London. And I did this short course, and there was a girl who was my teacher, who's now one of my best friends, and they were doing a demonstration exercise on perspectives. And she said, who wants to volunteer? And I've been volunteering this, what I thought was emotionally safe topic of, why am I not practicing yoga anymore? I used to be really into yoga. I was doing it every day. Why not? And I'd had lots of people try and coach me on it, and I couldn't unpick it. And so it was my safe kind of question. And I was like, sure. And I was like, she's like, what would you like coaching on? I said, why am I not doing yoga anymore? And she's like, okay. And we tried some perspective stuff, and she's really a really skilled coach. And at one point she said, can I just sit with you for a minute and ask you some questions? I know we're supposed to be talking about perspective, but I just want to ask you a few things. And I said, sure. And I've got 20 people watching me. And she said, you turn up here every week in your corporate suit and your pinned up kind of lifestyle, and I just don't buy it. And by this point, I'm starting to internally shake. And she said, what I see with you is an intense vulnerability. And I was trying so hard not to cry. And what she did in that moment was decoupled my grief of having Ruby from my yoga. So what I'd done is I'd given birth to Ruby. I was deep in grief, and we'd practice yoga every day. And what I'd found was I couldn't then practice yoga without thinking about my daughter. And so I'd
stop the yoga.
Right. And and it was a 7-minute coaching session.
Wow. So she did that all very, very fast.
And so that for me then led to that coaching is a really powerful tool to create change. And so I then went and did my coaching certification. But the grief I'm still learning about the grief.
Do you believe in the 7 stages of grief?
Elizabeth Kubler-Ross?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that's really helpful from an academic perspective when you're looking at that framework. And is it also helpful in the beginning to think, okay, there's a process of I can get through this? Yeah. I didn't really look at it. I use it in corporate sometimes to help people move through change. So when corporations are moving through change, that process. But I think what was more helpful to me was that quote that woman said to me, which is, you have to go through the heart of what is painful to find a deep and unshakable peace. So if I'd have just gone back to work and pretended all that hadn't happened, I would have been walking around in a very unsafe way. And that actually happened for the first few weeks. I went back to work and I was in a different team by this point, and one of the girls was pregnant, and she kept wanting to show me her nursery of her baby, and I was just like, I didn't know her very well.
Did she know what you'd been through?
Yeah, everyone did.
Why would she do that?
She just didn't think. I don't think it was malicious. I
Yeah,
think she just didn't think.
Of course, yeah. She's in her own excitement and her own world and not empathising.
No. And so I was really proud of myself with this. I asked to speak to her privately, and I remember going to a room and, you know, my heart was racing and my hands were sweating. And I said to her, I'd really like to share something with you, and spoke to her about, when you show me those photos, I'm really happy for you, but I'm incredibly sad for me, and I find it really hard to see them without thinking about my own grief. So can you not show me them anymore? And she was hugely apologetic. She didn't even make the connection. But I think, you know, my options were I could have just put up with it and been bitter and twisted about it, or I could own it and really speak to her. But that was kind of the moment where I thought, I can't do work anymore. I've got to do something different.
Right. That's where you made the change. I think that's really interesting what you've said there, because that's something that I've been to coaching for, is finding my voice and saying what I need or how I feel or how people are affecting me. And that's incredibly powerful. And people respond really, really well if you do it in a kind, open, mindful way.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that I've learnt massively from coaching, and that's something that you did naturally, but it's something for our listeners to really take on board.
I think if you get the intention right.
Yeah.
So my intention wasn't to make her feel like shit. That was not my intention.
No.
My intention was to
make
create
her
and understand what I needed. So in my work with Brene, we talk about boundaries, what's okay and what's not okay, and getting really clear on, because boundaries are different for everyone. But what is okay for me is for her to talk about her baby. It's not okay for her to show me pictures of the nursery, because they were really triggering. But until I kind of was clear on what's okay and what's not okay, and my intention, I think if you do nothing else, get clear on your intention. If you're going to have a courageous conversation, whether it's with someone you love, someone you work with, get clear on your intention first. And if your intention is to make the other person lose, feel bad, and one-upmanship, don't have the conversation. You're not ready.
Yeah, that's so true. Let me just, for the listeners, go through the 7 stages of grief: shock, anger, denial, depression, guilt, bargaining, acceptance.
Absolutely.
Do you feel like that is the process, even though you've been using other...
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So if I use that as a lens to look back, I'm not sure it's helpful when you're in it. I'm not sure if had I looked at that and gone, oh, I'm in denial right now. I do remember at the very beginning not believing any of it, going, this can't be true. This has to be not right. Something, you're not seeing something, or you're seeing, you know, there was definitely that. And I don't know that I did the bargaining piece, which is around, if I do this, this will happen. Like, I don't know that I'm not religious. I'm an atheist, so I didn't like bargain with God or anything like that.
No, but you might have bargained with your money and your travel.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? Like making life changes because you could.
Yeah.
You know, you had to make all those choices.
Yeah.
I think that really could be considered bargaining, couldn't
I definitely got through the anger piece. My husband and I have treated it with real care. So we have footprints of Ruby. We sent them to our families, and we have her urn. So we had her cremated. So we have her urn with her ashes in. And what was incredibly interesting about the grief process between my husband and me is that he was really connected to her ashes. You could lose them and it wouldn't bother me.
Oh, that's really interesting.
It did not connect me to the emotion of the situation at all. What does connect me to it? So every year on her birthday, the day she was born, we do a celebration of the things that we think she would have loved had she been well and alive. So we went to the ballet one year. We took the kids to Disneyland last year. And it's interesting. So Rosie, who's almost 5, so they all know about Ruby, and she knows she had a big sister who wasn't well, and she'll talk about Ruby. And she said, you know, remember we went to Disneyland last year for Ruby's birthday? And people go, who's Ruby? And then I've got to integrate that.
Yeah, that's cool though.
It's that integration into our lives, owning our stories.
There you go.
Do you know what?
Not pushing it aside. It's part of the process, isn't it? And a lot of people, they get stuck in that denial phase because they push it all away.
And it means I can get through this, you know, conversation with you without falling apart because I've done the work.
Yes.
And, you know, it's 7 years, but I've done the work.
Yeah.
And I'm still doing the work.
Yeah. And it will be a lifelong process, really, won't it? You know, I think it is. My mum gave birth to twins when they were 6 months old back in the 60s, and there were no, facilities to have them survive like they would have in this day and age.
Pregnant.
She was 6 months pregnant and she went into early labour. And her friend, who was pregnant at the same time and 3 months ahead of her, went into labour the same day, and they literally had to wheel her out and wheel the friend in to give birth to a healthy baby. One lived for a week, one lived for 2 weeks. I can remember still going, I was 3, I can remember going to the hospital to see the girl in the humid crib, Sarah, and my mum never, ever, ever had any counselling for it. And the doctor ran into her coming out of the hardware store in this little country town in Australia and said, "You were very lucky that they didn't survive because they would have been disabled." And my mum got great comfort from that one comment, but she's never had any other therapy or any other support or work through that grief. Yeah.
I've talked about this a lot, and back then it was a move on.
Yes.
Forget that ever happened, move on with your life.
Yeah, go on and have more children.
Yeah, what happens is you can't. That grief doesn't go away. It stays and it eats into your life. Whether you know it or not, it turns out in how you treat people and what your relationships are like. Like, it's not benign. Like, it goes somewhere until you move through it. And that has been one of the most powerful, my grief is one of the most powerful experiences I've ever had. And I think talking about it is even more powerful, because I think a lot of us are walking around with stories of grief that we haven't visited. And do you know what? Since I put the Anatomy of Grief out, my friends have gone, "Oh my God, I need someone should go to that." I know someone, we all have grief. And so what I want to do with that work is use, Ruby's story and everything I've learned. I now have the ability to talk to anyone about their grief because of Ruby, because I know what I needed during that process was for someone to sit and listen to me.
Yeah. And you can connect with them because you've been in that same place.
It's amazing.
And, that comes back to that empathy, doesn't it?
It does.
You have that empathy.
Yeah.
And I think that's really important. You said you're putting out the Anatomy of Grief for these workshops you're running in Hong Kong, are they? Great. Tell us about them.
So it's a 3-hour workshop where we talk about the concept of grief and how to break it down, and then the benefits of how to talk about it. And people can come along and they don't have to share their stories of grief. It's not about that, but it's a place where you can if you want. And what I do with all of my workshops is I tell my story. I start them off with my story, whether it's my body love, my body safety, or the grief workshop. I set the tone with the safety up front with sharing mine, which is back to Brene's work on vulnerability. Like, being able to speak about my own vulnerabilities when it comes to grief, when it comes to loving my body or the body safety, allows other people to connect and to really see, gosh, if she can talk about it, then maybe I can kind of step into it a little bit. So my workshops are on www.livebraveworkshops.com, and you can go to the workshop section and it's all in there.
Okay, perfect. So thank you for sharing your story of grief. That's incredibly powerful, and I think will be amazingly helpful for other people who are stuck in their own grief.
Do you know what?
It'll be quite inspiring.
There's one place you can go in Hong Kong for support as well. There's a Facebook group called Hope Hong Kong, and that is for people who are struggling with conceiving. If you've had miscarriage, losses, it is the most beautiful part of the World Wide Web where people hold the space for you. So if you are struggling with infertility, Hope Hong Kong is a really nice place to go and visit.
Oh, great. Thank you for mentioning that. So can you tell me a little bit about the importance of body love and how does that impact people? Because so many of us, particularly women, judge ourselves all the time and we're never happy.
So body love, it's another one of my big stories, is not loving my body. I was raised in a family where weight was talked about a lot. How much I weighed, how much my mother weighed, how much her sisters weighed. So it was a topic, and it still is. And I think that's, fairly commonplace. The impact that had on me was that I definitely came through my teens thinking that my self-worth was measured in kilograms, and that the skinnier I was, the more lovable I was. And that didn't just come from my family. That came from my peers, from social media. Well, social media back then was magazines.
Yeah, Dolly.
Yeah. So actually there was this magazine called B Magazine. Yeah. I remember when I was in my teens. So Friends was really big back then, the TV show. And it had the heights and weights of Julia Roberts and Courtney Cox
Oh,
from Friends.
no, you mean...
No, it had Julia Roberts, but it also had Courtney Cox from Friends.
Oh, right,
so
okay,
it had both
sorry.
of them. And
okay.
Julia Roberts was, way taller than I am and weighed the same as I did. Courtney Cox was the same height as me and weighed 20 kilos less than I did. And so I think back then I was like 60 kilograms as a 17-year-old, whatever I was, and she was 40.
Which is dangerously low.
Which is
anorexic.
Anorexic.
Yeah.
Do you know what I did? I cut that out and I stuck it on my wall as something to aim for.
Wow.
And I did. Like, I stopped eating.
Did you end up with an eating disorder?
I did.
Oh, gosh. Tell me about that.
So that started when I was about 12.
Mm.
I had seen an episode of Different Strokes, and Kimberly, the sister, had some supermodel friends, and she'd invited them over and they were eating cake and throwing up to stay skinny. And so my friend Steph and I were like, we should try that. We were like 12 and I was really good at it.
Oh.
And so I started using that as a coping mechanism for the stress in my life as a 12-year-old. And so I had bulimia until I was 19.
Wow.
And anorexia from 19 to 21, where there was validation. Like, the skinnier I was,
more
the
people
more people liked
you
it.
look great.
You look well. What are you doing? You're amazing. And I didn't believe any of it. I thought there was a lot of still shame around it. And, I think these not loving our body can creep into all areas of your life. It stopped me from going to parties. I was a dancer. It stopped me dancing. It stopped me putting myself out there. Body love isn't just about size and weight. The body love crept into my life through the infertility. My body didn't do what it was supposed to do.
It let you down.
Yeah, it totally let me down. I remember saying to my husband at one point, go and find a woman whose body can have kids and, marry her because mine can't. Oh. And so body love isn't...
That's intense.
It was massive.
To feel like that. Yeah.
Massive. And so body love for me has been, it's a journey. It's a lifelong journey. It's not a destination. For some people it may be, but for me it is a daily choice to be kind to myself. So Brene's work around self-compassion really lends itself well to the body love journey, which is, so self-compassion, she takes her self-compassion work from the work of Kristen Neff, and she has 3 components to self-compassion. 1, mindfulness, so knowing that you're in struggle. The second part is common humanity, knowing that I'm not alone, that I'm not the first woman who doesn't love her body. And thirdly, self-kindness, speaking to yourself like you would a friend. So, and there's practices you can learn.
You wouldn't say you're fat, you look like shit to your friend, would you?
Get your ass back to the gym. Yeah. What's wrong with you?
Yeah, you wouldn't say that.
And the way especially after having twins, so I had this body shame from when I was young and I'd worked through it a lot. I did a lot of processing in my 20s and 30s to work through my eating disorders and got to a really good place. And then it came back when I started the pregnancy with twins. So my body had bounced back after my first child quite successfully. And then with the twins, it started to morph into like an unrecognizable body.
Yeah, because you get massive.
Yeah, massive. And
did that do your head in?
Oh my God. So my shame came back. I remember sitting outside. There was a classified in Tai Hang. We moved to Hong Kong, sitting on the curb, call my best friend in Sydney and say, how can I teach my daughter to love her body if I can't love my own? And I went to what I knew, which was Brene's shame resilience model. And I went back to it and I went through the shame resilience. What are my triggers? And one of the stories which I think is hilarious and shows you the extent of my struggle with my body. We just moved to Hong Kong. I've got a 19-month-old and I'm pregnant with twins. So 6 months pregnant with twins looks like 9 months with full term. We are staying at a hotel because we've been transferred here before we find accommodation. I take my toddler down to the pool, getting her dressed. I walk past about 6 or 7 guys with washboard abs, hot guys. So by this point I'm 38. I'm 6 months pregnant with twins. I walk past them. I hold my stomach in.
Right, that's weird.
That is so it's an instant reaction for me to just go, make yourself look thinner. First of all, I'm 38. They're 21. I'm married. What was I doing? It's just ingrained in me to be thinner. It's that messages that are just in me that I just have to, it's a daily choice to challenge those messages and be critically aware of them. And at what cost? if I don't love my body, then I sure as shit I'm not getting into a bathing suit and hopping into the pool with my kids.
Yeah, you miss out. Loads of women miss out on that.
Oh my God. So I was in Australia. I was the only woman in the pool. Like, it was all the dads.
Yeah.
And, you know, they didn't have bikini bodies. Like, you know.
Yeah, they had dad bods.
Yeah. And so I was like, oh my God, that shame is stopping you connecting with your kids.
That's crazy. So do you really think about the way that you talk about your body in front of your girls?
Absolutely.
Oh, hang on. How many kids have you got now? 3?
Oh, yeah.
What have you got?
So Rosie, so she's almost 5, and the twins, Jack and Maggie, just turned 3.
Right, so 2 girls.
And we didn't get back to it, so they're all donor conceived. So
right.
egg donor.
Oh,
yeah. So,
great, brilliant.
Yeah.
So then it was just 2 successes after that, was it?
Oh, no.
Uh-oh.
No. No, so donor eggs, I was like, that's got to be a sure thing. No, I had 2 miscarriages with donor eggs.
Oh, my God, more grief to deal with.
More grief before. And then Rose, it was the last round. I said, we're at round number 10 by this point, and we'd, you know, spent hundreds of thousands of dollars by this point. I said to Adam, I'll give it one more go, and that's it.
And that was
Rosie. And then we had 2. So when she was 1, so our egg donor is in Spain, and so the embryos are in Spain. And this is probably a whole nother conversation about the anonymity of egg donor, and because it's actually illegal in Australia and the UK. So if you are looking at getting an egg donor, getting an open donor is much better for the child because they can meet that person, whereas we didn't know that, and we have an anonymous egg donor, so our children by law won't get to meet her, and we're going to work really hard over, you know, our whole lives to see if we can access her, so our kids can meet her and have a full view of who they are as people. Yeah, it's massive.
So we were talking about how...
What do you love?
Yeah, you speak positively about yourself in front of your kids, and you get out in the pool and you do...
Yeah.
And is it hard for you to do it, or are you in a good place now?
It's getting easier. So the self-compassion piece is a practice. So this is a choice for me to speak to myself kindly every time I feel shame around my body. So knowing my triggers and being able to practice shame resilience as I move through it. So it's slowly I'm retraining my brain to come from a place of self-compassion. So instead of being what are people going to think if you get, you know, your ass out in a bikini and go into the pool now? What do you think of you? Like, there's a lot of shame. And what I do is I'm very quick to recognize it and say, do you know what? You've had 3 kids, 4 including Ruby.
And twins.
And twins.
Double stretching.
And you're 42.
Yeah.
Like, you know, no one cares as much about your body as you think.
And we have to have these conversations with ourselves to get out there, don't we? It's so interesting for me because hitting menopause, which is going to be our next topic, I've put on a lot of weight. I've probably put on 8 kilos, which for some women is not a lot. Some put on 20 or 30 in menopause. I'm 6 foot tall. I'm 93 kilos. I'm pretty heavy. I'm very good at getting out of my bikini with my mates on llama, on the beach, don't care. But then I think there's part of me that feels that this is why I'm still single. I've been single for most of my life. One of the little voices in the back of my head is it's because I'm fat. And I'm not actually fat. No. I'm just a big, strong, capable woman. But, you know, my focus is all on my tummy and it is huge, and I've got to up my sizes of my clothes. I had to go to Australia and buy bigger sizes because I'm so big I can't even get the clothes here in Hong Kong except Marks and Sparks. That's the only place I can shop in Hong Kong. But it's so interesting. There's a part of me that's like, stuff it. I'm fine, out in my bikini. I don't care. Wear what I want. Then there's the other part of me that's a little bit sort of like, oh, you're so fat. That's why you're single. And it's not true.
Those shame tapes are powerful. They're not enough. So you'll hear Brene talk about these shame tapes like we're not thin enough, we're not pretty enough, not smart enough, not promoted enough, not strong enough. They're all these scarcity tapes that we play that if we do lose those 10 kilos, we'll be more worthy. If I do, you know, if I am thinner, then people will love me more.
And you'll get more compliments and noticed as well. But the other interesting thing is that because I have this weight on, I look younger. The fat fills out the wrinkles in your face. It really does. I'm 52, but I look young. And, you know, and I've got these great boobs. Do you know, if I was skinny, I would look older and I wouldn't have these boobs. Do you know what I mean? So it's like, well, you know, what do you want, your face or your body? And at the end of the day, it's just like focus on the positive.
It's a choice, right? Like it's a choice to, you know, and some days...
Well, I'd like to choose to not be. I'd like to be just... I'm not even greedy. I'd just like to be under 90 kilos. Do you know what I mean? I'd just like to get back into the 80s, lose 5 kilos. That would make a difference on how I feel about myself and how I look. But at the same time, I work with kids where I'm saying embrace who you are. Be healthy. But I've got all these issues with knees and wrist and injuries that, you know, mean that I've had to stop all the sport I was doing. I don't know. Oh, okay, this is turning into a therapy session.
I want to ask you questions now. I'm like, what makes you think of the 8 kilo? Like, what does that mean?
Well, I think it's something about numbers, isn't it? Because if I say to somebody I'm 93 kilos, they're going to think, holy crap, that's huge. But for somebody 6 foot tall, that is my body size and shape, it's not that massive. Do you know what I mean?
It's interesting you say that, because I remember when I had my eating disorders when I was young, I have diaries that say if you weigh more than 60 kilos, you should kill yourself.
Holy moly. See, do you know what? I don't even remember what I weighed before 40.
Yeah.
I never weighed myself. I was always slim, very sporty, didn't really care. It wasn't an issue. And I still keep thinking I should throw my scales away.
Absolutely. So, I don't weigh myself now, but I know that I'm definitely not under 60 kilograms, but I really had to post-kids shift that. And it's a grief process, the grief of the body I used to have.
Yes.
And comparison is so dangerous. And what I've noticed in my work with Body Love is that when we're young, we compare ourselves to other people. Julia Roberts, the girl on Facebook. Like, Facebook is the devil when it comes to comparison, because we look at it and go, we should look like that. As we get older, we compare ourselves to our younger self. So I'm not comparing myself to Jennifer Aniston or Courtney Cox now. I'm thinking I'm comparing myself to my body pre-babies.
Exactly. And the irony of it is back then we thought
I didn't like my body anyway.
And we didn't realise how young we looked or how beautiful we were and how great our bodies were. So it's like this lack of appreciation. And when I'm 80, I'm going to look back and think, oh, when you were in your 50s, you were amazing.
Exactly.
And the other thing that I want to point out is being my size and living in Asia is much harder. It's psychologically more of a struggle because I'm more humongous.
Yeah.
And, you know, I've got so many people, and this is another podcast that people can listen to, The Matchmaker number 16, where I talk to a dating coach about my aversion to dating somebody smaller than me. And I just can't. And that is not going to change. Yeah, I can be more flexible on lots of other things, but that ain't going to change because of this life of feeling so massive. And then if I go to America or Australia where there are people more my size, I don't feel so big. Yeah. So I think there's a difficulty for many Western women who are living in Asia who are a bit larger, because you're surrounded by this tiny, small, a very sort of androgynous culture around you. So it's really interesting, isn't it?
Yeah.
So in Hawaii, lying on the beach, I felt positively slim, but then going out to the beach here in Hong Kong, I'm like, wow,
And different cultures have different body love. So it's complex, right?
Yeah.
So body love is not a straightforward topic.
No.
But what I talk about in my workshop is the tools and strategies that you can use on a daily basis to be kind to yourself.
And it's positive affirmations is one, isn't it?
Absolutely. And owning your story. Like having a look back at where those messages that said thin is more worthy as opposed to being strong. We start it when kids are young. Our girls, oh, you're so pretty, or you're so beautiful. And we talk about their bodies, and we have to change those tapes because we do it much less with boys.
Have you seen that ad, Run Like a Girl?
No, I don't have a TV, which is nice.
No, it's on YouTube.
Oh, is it?
Yeah, Run Like a Girl. So check it out. And then,
is it a dove?
And then,
yes, I have seen that. Yeah.
And then it's like the little girls are like running hard, and and then there's people flopping around and it's just like, that's so true.
It's above the age of about 7.
Yeah, there's this perception that being like a girl means that you're weak or you're pathetic or you're not strong, and that your body it will fail you and all that sort of stuff, and it's not. And I've got to remind myself I've got to value my youth and my my youthfulness and my strength and my ability to connect with people and all the positive things, and don't focus on this large tummy that I have that is a symptom of menopause anyway.
Yeah. I did a beautiful piece of work through Brene's, which was she has a tool called Compassionate Whispers, and it is looking back at your younger self when you were struggling and really remembering what that struggle was like, and imagining yourself putting your hand on the shoulder of that younger you and saying something compassionate, offering some compassionate advice. The first time I did that, I did it to my 21-year-old self who was just at the end of my anorexia. And my compassionate whisper I've like memorized because I think it was so powerful. And it is, people will love you for how you make them feel, not what you look like or what you do for a job.
That's beautiful.
And that is now, it's so in my brain that it becomes when I have those shame moments, when I feel, you know, get your ass back to the gym, I can say, people will love you, Beck, for how you make them feel, not what you look like, not what you do for a job, how you make them feel.
And that is so true. And thank you for saying that to me, because that's what I need to hear. I have an affirmation that I've used all my life, and it's warrior am I, and from the battle I emerge triumphant. Wow. Isn't that cool? Like it's like
say it again, say it slowly for me.
Warrior am I, and from the battle I emerge triumphant.
Yeah.
And it's just like, it's that strength and that power, which is so important to me.
I love the word warrior, though. I love there's a quote from Brene's work which I think will resonate with you. Have you heard her Theodore Roosevelt quote? Oh my God, can I read that to you? Because please. I think it's the cornerstone of Daring Greatly, actually, her book. So basically what happened with Brene, she did her TED Talk on vulnerability, and she thought it was just of 500 people, and she was really testing some things out when it came to how she spoke about her work, because she's from a very academic background. And so it was really just her playing with talking about vulnerability and being vulnerable. And she said when she finished it, she went home and she had like this shame vulnerability hangover. And she went back, she was Googling. So it ended up going live. And then she's like, oh my God, 800 people have seen it. And then, oh my God, 1 million people have seen it. It's now got 26 million views.
I know, it's crazy.
But she said just before she started writing Daring Greatly, and this was the inspiration for the book, is that her friends had said to her, whenever you've got your work online, don't go and look at the comments that people put. And so she went and looked at all of the comments, and she said she went into this shame spiral, and she said, you know, when you're watching TV and you're watching, like she said she was obsessed with Downton Abbey, and said she said she'd watch, like she was in a shame spiral. So she said she grabbed a bucket of ice cream and just watched 10 episodes of Downton Abbey. And she said she got to the end of it, and you know when you don't want those TV shows to end because you have to go back to like your life and thinking about the shame that you're carrying. She said, so she started Googling who was the president at the time, where was it set? And she came across this quote, which is the cornerstone of her work. So she uses the metaphor of being in the arena as being somewhere where you want to show up and be seen and be braver. And that can be a conversation with your partner. It can be a conversation with your boss. It can be talking about your shame story. So arenas can be big or small, but they require some risk, emotional risk. And this is her quote. So it's from Theodore Roosevelt. It is not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles or where the doer of deeds could have done them better. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs, who comes short again and again because there is no effort without error and shortcoming, but who does actually strive to do the deeds, who knows great enthusiasms, the great devotions, who spends himself in a worthy cause, who at the best in the end knows the triumph of high achievement, and who at worst, if he fails, at least he fails while daring greatly. And she said she read that and her whole world shifted, and that was the inspiration for the title of the book.
Oh, that's awesome. And that really made me think about the fact that I tell my kids when they failed that they can learn more from their failures than their successes. Absolutely. And that they'll make them stronger, better people. Yeah. And that to fail is not only okay, but can be really turned into a good thing.
Imagine learning that as a kid. Like, that would be phenomenal to learn that as a kid.
But anyway, Rebecca, thank you so much for joining me today. Thanks for this amazing conversation on 7,000 topics. It's been brilliant. And
thank you for having me.
If anyone out there listening wants to get in touch with you for any of your workshop or to have coaching, how can they do that?
www.livebraveworkshops.com.
Great. So I have a feeling you might have a few
body love,
parents, infertile.
Do you know what the one that most people want to talk about is the egg donor? The egg donor. I get a lot of people wanting to know what it's like to parent children that you're not genetically connected to. Yeah. And that's a whole nother conversation, but that's one that I get most contacted about.
And I might actually get back to you on that because I am doing that as one of my
That's the one podcasts. I'm passionate about, because when we don't talk about these things, we create shame within our children that we're raising. So I'm deeply passionate about being open about egg donation and my kids' journey into this
Great.
world.
Well, let's get on to that another time.
Sounds great. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much. Hi, Confidants. I want to tell you about my Patreon page. I've joined Patreon in the hope of getting sponsorship for my Hong Kong Confidential podcast. Patreon is a great way for my listeners to get on board and sponsor me with monthly payments, and that goes towards my production costs and rewards for my members. If you're interested in checking out my Patreon page, please go to patreon.com and search up Jules Hannaford or Hong Kong Confidential. I would really appreciate you visiting my page. So that brings us to the end of another Hong Kong Confidential podcast. I'm Jules Hannaford. Thanks for joining me, and I hope you'll be with me again next week. If you enjoyed today's podcast, please can you go to iTunes to rate and review it. I would really appreciate your feedback. You can email me at jules@hongkongconfidential.net, and you can find me on Facebook and Instagram at Hong Kong Confidential. If you'd like to hit me up on Twitter, it's at Jules Hannaford. I would love to hear from you.
Are you a podcaster? Maybe you've got that big idea and you're looking for a network to join. The multi-award-winning Ozcast network can get your content to eyes and ears all over the world. Join now for the first month free, and you could be featuring this sound at the beginning of your podcast.
Ozcast.
Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.